on unipolarism. This is an article that I read when I was in grad school, and it's a bit dated, but I think it still works. I think as far as the theory of unipolarism is concerned, it functions incredibly well, particularly when we look at the role of the United States emerging from the Cold War. Because as we remember, Soviet Union collapses, the bipolar system that dominated the international arena for 45 years comes to an end. 1990, 1991, America finds itself alone at the top. In other words, unipolarism as a theory of IR is a limited and relatively unstable period. Unipolarism sows the seeds of its own demise, in the sense that, according to most theorists, realists, constructivists, among others, unipolarism is an inevitable prelude to multipolarity, simply because states naturally balance against the hegemon. Now, this is painfully obvious when it comes to realist thinking. Balance of power effectively dictates that states will balance against the major hegemon. When there's only one country in the world that dominates all others, it is effectively borrowed time. Right? They're on limited time frame here. Okay? In that regard, unipolarism never really lasts long. Unipolarism can last anywhere from a few years to the absolute best, about a decade and a half. That's about it. But during that time period, that one remaining power is working to shore up its own security and national interest against emerging, challenging national interests of other countries. In other words, unipolarism plants the seeds of its own demise. One should not think that the minute that there is one country that dominates the world, or traditionally the region, that country will remain the dominant country in perpetuity. Not really. In many situations, unipolarism gives way to multipolarism, either through one of two avenues. Number one, the unipolar power spends itself into bankruptcy trying to stay on top. Or number two, there is just the simple and natural condition of second-tier states that eventually achieve a certain degree of development and notoriety in various corners of the world that just simply make unipolarism disappear. It doesn't reduce the power of the unipolar power, but it simply brings more kids to the proverbial tire playground. So unipolarism will give way either to voluntary withdrawal or aggressive rebalancing. Aggressive rebalancing is the least stable and oftentimes results in large-scale conflicts. Voluntary withdrawal is simply the unipolar state acknowledging that it is no longer the sole authority in the region, and it must share responsibility with other countries for the collective benefit of all. So unipolarism, as all theories will argue, is again limited, unstable, and short-lived. But it need not be violent, and it need not be confrontational. As a matter of fact, it's worth looking into how other theories look at it. Realism is simply going to say, and this one time the realists are absolutely correct. Realism argues that unipolarism lasts only for a short period of time. However, constructivists and liberals change that opinion slightly. In my opinion, and again, I want to emphasize my opinion, so you are free to agree, disagree, however way you want. But in my opinion, constructivism offers the best example of how unipolarism can be viewed. Because under constructivism, balance of power, as we remember from the beginning of the semester, gives way to a more nuanced understanding called balance of threats. Therefore, argues constructivists, states will balance against a potential threat to their own interests, to their own security, not just blindly balancing against the hegemon. And that explains why the United States was able to effectively dominate international discourse throughout most of the 1990s. We can arguably say, and again, the date range is somewhat fuzzy, but we can arguably say that U.S. unipolarism lasted about a decade. about a decade, from roughly 1990/1991 until September 11, 2001, or the absolute least, 2003, with the Second Gulf War. Okay? But certainly, for sure, during the 1990s, the United States dominated the international discourse. How do we measure hegemony? What do we look at? Like, realism would just simply say, let's just kind of compare how big each other's military is, okay? You know, grunt. But liberalism, on the other hand, tells us that hegemony can also be ideological. And what was American international ideology during the Cold War? It was based on a mixture of both transnational capitalism and at least ideological, if not practical, ideological adherence to democratic peace theory. Which means that even in the absence of the United States performing its tasks as a clear hegemon, that ideology, according to liberalism, should continue, should remain untouched, quote unquote, after hegemony. In other words, once the United States ceases to be the sole power in the world, the international system that the United States had set up to define its hegemony, to define its power, should still be active. In fact, we should see that even redoubled as emerging powers practice the same type of strategy. Here's where liberalists may get the final word in. Even though the realists run the argument, the realists may say, well, hang on a second. American unipolarism may in fact be already gone. We may very well be in an era of multipolarism at this point. The United States is certainly one of the major countries. But whatever polarism it happens to be, uni, bi, or multi, we are still operating within the international structure that the United States set up in 1944, beginning with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that should at least be one final parting gift to America's lasting contribution to global order and arguably global peace. But still, regardless of whether you're looking at it from a realist, a constructivist, or a liberalist point of view, unipolarism as a phenomenon is a short-lived period, and one that is oftentimes marked by that unipolar power not going gracefully. That's the other thing. So we examine unipolarism as Pax Americana. And that's at least one very positive aspect. Because American unipolarism was marked more by the United States being what Lane refers to as a benign hegemony. Right? There's two types of hegemonies. You can be benign or you can be aggressive. I think it's pretty straightforward what a benign and an aggressive hegemony is. An aggressive hegemony is one that asserts power through force and coercion. A benign hegemony is one that asserts power through cooperation and investment. And that, I think, defines very, very clearly U.S. foreign policy, at least as far as their transatlantic partners, from the 40s through the 90s. And what we see with the collapse of the Cold War, and as I've mentioned already, it's not so much a victory for democracy as it is a victory for global capitalism. And so economic security takes over earlier understandings of military security. The United States exerts its power more through money than through tanks. Sometimes it's hard to see, but at the end of the day, the United States exerts its hegemony through economic means, not through military. That in and of itself is money in the bank, as far as the United States is concerned, because American unipolarism was marked by a triumph of both commercial pacifism and democratic peace theory. Right? For the first time, the world was under the sway of a power that adhered to the principles and beliefs of Woodrow Wilson, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant. First time. As a matter of fact, it's the only time the United States emerges as a unipolar power, not as a power within any particular region, but across the planet. The United States is the first global unipolar power. Be that as it may, the United States has vacillated between both benign hegemony and aggressive hegemony. what Lane and others argue, and I think that Lane is more of a constructivist than a realist. He's a student of Ken Waltz, which automatically places him within realist orthodoxy. But he seems to definitely be pushing this notion of perception and image. And in that regard, I think Lane is spot on when he says that benign hegemonies will last a lot longer than aggressives. But even there, benign hegemonies can be seen as potentially aggressive, can be seen as possibly competitive, even more so. It doesn't matter whether the hegemony sees itself as benign or aggressive. Any time the hegemony sees a challenge to its rule, to its decision-making, it will interpret that as a challenge to its own authority. Okay? And the reason why unipolarism sows the seeds of its own demise is that the minute the hegemon takes efforts to shore up its own strength and counter the narratives and counter the strategies of other would-be competing powers, that hegemony is automatically seen as a competitor. Doesn't matter whether it's aggressive or benign. Once it is perceived that the unipolar power is trying to preserve its position at the top, challenging powers redouble their efforts. Okay? How they do that and why they do that is still up for debate. Some countries want to take a more aggressive approach to the United States. That much is certain. But other countries are not interested in toppling the United States. They're not interested in weakening the United States. They just have their own interests. They have their own national strategies. And they feel that they really don't need to play second fiddle to the United States anymore. The United States, particularly after 9/11, particularly as the aggressive rhetoric in the Bush administration's war on terror policy becomes more and more pronounced, with the axis of evil speech, with the circumvention of international law at the United Nations, with the idea that the United States declaring that it will not ever see itself as constrained by some UN agency to defend its own national interests. All of a sudden, the United States goes from a relatively open and cooperative hegemony in the 90s to a far more aggressive and dangerous hegemony in the first decade of the 2000s. Now, it is arguable whether or not the United States has somewhat receded under the Obama administration. But there are enough countries in the world, both democratic and otherwise, that consider the United States to be just as much of a threat to global stability and order as any of the so-called rogue states or rogue regimes out there in the world. Whatever it is, whether or not the United States acts aggressively or passively, okay, states, and this is the constructivist argument, will act against a threat of hegemony, not the hegemonic identity. So it's not that we're anti-American, certainly not anti-American. We're anti-American foreign policy that is increasingly one-sided, increasingly seen as self-centered, increasingly seen as detrimental to peace. So what about then benign? What if in a parallel universe, the United States remained consistently benign? Let's say there was no war on terror. Let's say there was no 9/11. Or let's say that the United States formed a more effective coalition with international partners, regardless of political ideology or orientation. Let's just say that benign hegemony continued to run. Lane and others will still say benign hegemonies will still collapse. Benign unipolar powers will still collapse. It will take longer, and it will be less pronounced, but unipolarism will still give way for a number of reasons that we don't look at usually. Number one, during the bipolar system that defined the Cold War, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two major powers. Okay? And realism argues, rather convincingly, that a bipolar system cancels each other's interests out. Bipolarity is paradoxically the most peaceful, or the most stable, that's probably a better word. But we also talked about this understanding that during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union had their, what we call, second-tier allies. Right? The United States had Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, whatever. Soviet Union had its own group of people. When the Soviet Union collapses, the second-rate powers under the Soviet system no longer have any kind of control. So they largely gravitate towards the West. And they're welcomed, for the most part, with open arms. Here is where Lane is really spot on. Because with the Soviet Union no longer serving as the proverbial other, as the constant and perennial enemy, the existing second-rate powers under the previous US system, particularly Japan, West Germany, France, begin to see their second-rate position as diminishing returns. They benefited from the US system. They were the major recipients of US economic aid, economic cooperation, and as far as the Germans and Japanese were concerned, military security. This was fantastic. But at some point, that type of dependency is going to become less and less of an asset and more of a liability. Because as these states grow and develop, at some point there's going to be what Lane and others refer to as a tipping point, where it is more costly to deliberately and forcibly maintain second fiddle, to being a country of your own, to going out on your own. Think about it like this. When you're a little kid and your parents teach you how to ride a bike, what is usually something that comes part of learning how to ride a bike? Besides falling down, we know that. As a matter of fact, what prevents you from falling down? Training wheels, right? And you learn how to ride a bike with training wheels, and you don't fall and you gain some confidence. But isn't it kind of obvious that there's a certain age where training wheels cease to be cute and people start talking about you behind your back? You know? I mean, when you're 5 and you're riding a bike with training wheels, okay. When you're 15 and you're riding a bike with training wheels, we won't talk about it behind your back. Okay? This is another invention that you millennials enjoyed that my generation never had to do. This is also something that has helped you people avoid constant and chronic embarrassment. We have these things called bumpers at the bowling alley now. Don't know what I'm talking about, right? Ever tried bowling as a little kid and you were like amazed if you can get a 10 because your ball actually hit one of the pins? When I was a kid, I hated bowling because it was a constant embarrassment for me. Oh, let me go. Ooh. Okay, gutter bowl, gutter bowl, gutter bowl. So what do people do to eventually avoid long years of eventual therapy that children have to go through? We put bumpers in the gutters. And it doesn't matter how stupid you are. As long as you don't throw the ball in another lane, you are eventually going to knock down some pins. Now, when you're bowling with bumpers from 5 to 7, that's cute. When you're still bowling with bumpers from 15 to 17, you're not going to impress that date that you took out. So at some point, and sort of a boon, a help, a crutch, becomes diminishing returns. Okay? At some point, you need to take off the training wheels. At some point, you become too old for the club. Okay? And that is where the 1990s provided that tipping point for a lot of these developed democracies. In the 1990s, Germany and Japan were probably the two countries that first sort of broke away from the US system. Germans and the Japanese saw firsthand the benefits of global capitalism in areas that had previously been cut off. And they start making deals left and right with countries like China and Russia and Eastern Europe and other things. They're not challenging US authority. They're just simply picking up. They're thanking the teacher for giving them that expertise, right? At some point, the student is going to outperform the teacher. At some point, the son will beat the father in arm wrestling, okay? And when that happens, it is the job of the mentor, the father, whatever, to go and say, nice job, son, as opposed to, fuck you. Okay? If the hegemony says, nice, then congratulations. We are not only looking at a benign hegemony, but we're looking at the continuation of an ideology via the liberalist lens. If the hegemony looks at that and sees that as a challenge to its authority, a potential threat to its own dominance, well, we got potential problems on our hands. Okay? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that unipolar powers don't necessarily fall. Okay? Realism is just simply going to say they fall. Liberalism and constructivism, they don't necessarily fall. They're just simply joined by other emerging powers. And, we've seen articles, we've seen reports, we've seen people talk over the past 10, 15 years about the so-called end of American dominance, or the post-American world, or the end of American hegemony. And that does not mean that Rome is falling. What it does mean is that the United States is no longer the one country that calls the shots. The United States is no longer the one authority that everybody looks to in the United Nations. But there are other countries and other powers with equally valid, in some cases even more valid reasons for moving forward on a particular event. That does not mean that these countries are out to destroy the United States. But what it does lead to is the ever important factor of perception. Because unipolarism ultimately ends because of perception. It is almost entirely focused on perception. Perceptions by the hegemonic power towards the rest of the world, and perceptions towards the hegemonic power by the rest of the world. So we, as the United States, we may see ourselves as benign. We may see ourselves as defenders of world order. And if you listen to American rhetoric, and I'm using the United States because, well, we're the one, we're the country. American rhetoric does not say we invade countries. We don't invade countries. What do? I heard it, say it. We liberate it. We don't invade countries, we liberate it. Our soldiers are not occupiers, but peacekeepers. Okay? And that rhetoric, I think, runs really strong in American political culture. You look at the history of America's military record, and we usually are the cavalry that needs to bail out another country or continent when someone else has an oopsie. Okay? Bailed out Europe in 2 world wars, defeated Germany twice, saved France twice, and we were very, very keen to remind the French of this in 2002 and 2003. Okay? So when other countries are protesting against American foreign policy, the gut reaction among leaders is to regard this criticism with the same degree of ridicule and scorn that patriots and conservatives in this country regard the anti-war crowd. And our foreign policy, I don't know if any of you remember this. How many of you were really keeping up with U.S. foreign policy about 10 years ago? I know that this is, 10 years ago you guys were in elementary school. But here we are talking about going into Iraq 2002, 2003. The United States was basically waging an internet comment war with the French, the Spanish, the Germans, and everyone else. Europe is against America's involvement in Iraq. We see that less as Europe providing constructive criticism, because Europe is not entitled to criticize the United States, but we see that as just simply people upset against American power. American foreign policy is like, look, we're going into Iraq to liberate them. We're going into Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction. Oh, and they're all over the place. We can't wait to find them to show you. Oh, France, you're going to be sorry. Okay? So every time that there is a criticism of U.S. foreign policy, we end up just simply criticizing the country, rather than being introspective. That's a defensive mechanism that hegemonic powers do. It's not just the United States. Other hegemonic powers in history have done the exact same thing. Okay? So we may see ourselves as benign. We may see ourselves as the good guys, the defenders of world order. And let's be honest, the United States is in a real unenviable position. since the 1990s, right? The world expects us to handle everyone else's problem, but yet when we handle the problem in a way that they don't like, all they do is bitch, moan, whine, and complain that we got ourselves involved. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Okay? If we sit by and do nothing, we're going to be criticized for what we didn't do in Rwanda. And if we do get ourselves involved, we're going to be blamed for the mess that we created in Iraq. Is it justified? That's up for debate. Okay? So in that regard, okay, the United States is in a very, very unenviable position because it's expected to, on one hand, drive the international arena into some form of prosperity, but it gets damned when that drive also, takes a few $100 off the top and puts it in their back pocket. That's just normal, right? That is just absolutely normal. And then there's the ever so problematic issue of intervention, which we talked about last week. The United States can play the bleeding heart card. The United States can decide to intervene to prevent mass murder, mass genocide. But it is also painfully obvious the United States cannot, has not, and will not intervene everywhere. So when the United States chooses to intervene in one and kind of ignores, overlooks, or downplays something that the information age argues is the same someplace else, the United States loses credibility. The United States can push for sovereignty and recognition of some disputed territories in the world, but it routinely vetoes Palestine's membership in the UN at the Security Council. The United States can chide Russia for intervening in Syria, but have absolutely no problem still arguing that going into Iraq in 2003 was the right thing to do, even though we didn't find a single weapon of mass destruction. So with that in mind, US foreign policy becomes much, much more limited and much more scrutinized. Okay? Now, the challenges to that hegemonic power, as I've said, should not be seen as threatening to the state. There is no state in the world today, there is not a single state in the world today that can openly challenge, legitimately challenge the United States. Economically, militarily, you name it. There are challengers to US interests, but they are regional challengers. There is not a single country that functions today as a global alternative. At least not yet. Okay? And yet, those challenges do not seek to topple the hegemonic power, but seek to rebalance the international system. The United States may be losing ground in its foreign policy in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. May be losing ground to its influence in East Asia. It may also be losing ground to its interests in Africa. But the United States is the only country where it has interests all around the world. Its challenges regionally are coming from Russia, China, Iran, within those regions. Okay? So any effort by the hegemon to shore up support for your own side and your own interests, congratulations, you've got yourself a security dilemma. Congratulations, good old-fashioned security dilemma. It does not take long for relations to deteriorate between erstwhile cooperative and allied countries. And the minute that a security dilemma comes across, whoops, you're on borrowed time. So, American unipolarism, do we still have it today? That's an interesting question. You may want to answer that in the discussion forums. Is the United States still the sole remaining power? This article was published in the early to mid-90s. So we're looking at this about 20 years down the road. Again, my opinion, we are, at best, at the 11th hour of American unipolarism. But more to the point, I feel that we are already in the first few years of a new multipolar world. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the United States still has a major role to play. But looking at the world today, November 2015, we can't help but note a number of points. Number one, America's global authority, America's unchecked global authority, has certainly diminished. That much is certain. We have seen the rise, as I've already mentioned, regional competitors. China in East Asia, Russia in most of the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Iran, you can thank Gulf War II for basically making Iran the deal maker and deal breaker of any solution, of any agreement in the Middle East. And even the European Union. It's not a country, and for the most part, when we talk about the European Union, we kind of sort of refer to Germany, but the European Union functions as a system, particularly German, French, Spanish, Luxembourgish, and other types of major economies in the world. And the European Union is certainly becoming more assertive in finding solutions to problems in Europe, and in particular, its relationship with Russia. The United States also has to take into account the increasing prevalence of alternative sources of information. And I left this one deliberately ambiguous, because it's not just the internet, but it is also emerging institutions that function as outlets for other countries and other voices. As much as we like to continue to deride and chide the United Nations Security Council as being an instrument of big power politics, you know what? I'm going to run with that right now. Great. Big power politics, which means there's 4 other countries in the world with black ball veto. And if they don't agree with something the U.S. is trying to push, congratulations. Your foreign policy has an expiration date on that. Not only that, the United States no longer holds the cards, no longer has cornered the market on law and morality. The United States, just like any other power, operates selective diplomacy. It chooses to support certain things here and deny the exact same things over there. The United States supports the sovereignty of breakaway statelets like Kosovo, but denies statehood for Palestine, or denies statehood for Nagorno-Karabakh. Sometime this week or next week, and I'm sure that you're all keeping abreast of this one, Catalonia may vote to secede from Spain. And Spain has said they will not recognize its independence for obvious reasons. And I doubt the United States will do the exact same thing. Why? Self-determination. Vox Populi. If it works over here, why can't it work over there? Uh-oh, a paradox. And it's really bad. It's really bad when Russia increasingly has the final say on what is moral and lawful in the world. That should not happen. That should not happen. When Lavrov or Putin point this out, as far as American foreign policy, that's an embarrassing moment, as far as the United States is concerned. Which leads us to make a third conclusion. Increasingly today, multilateral agreements need to be reached for conflict resolution. The United States cannot do it all on its own, depending upon the region. North Korea, there are 6 countries involved in finding a solution to denuclearizing North Korea, which never seems to work. China, Russia, Japan, United States, North and South Korea. But bringing in China, Russia, and Japan is an astute and very forward-thinking strategy of multilateral agreements. As far as Syria, hate to break it to you, you cannot find peace in Syria today without making a deal with the Russians and the Iranians. Full stop. You cannot. You're going to try to find a solution to Syria without Russia and Iran's influence? Lots of luck. Syria will not exist. Okay? Iran controls Hezbollah. So Russia effectively is financing Assad. You need that. What about Iran? What about Iran itself? Denuclearizing Iran. You need additional input. You need the United Nations. You need the European Union. You need Russia. And what about one that most people don't really look at? Climate change. You know? This may be the biggest challenge to global security. The idea that the temperatures rise, guess what? Miami won't be under the water. At some point, the Appalachians may be beachfront property. How does a country today tackle problems of the environment, global warming, population increase, scarcity of food? These are things that most people don't regard as hot IR subjects, but these are the day-to-day operations. Again, the United States cannot, nor has it ever tried to, go it alone. In that regard, it leads one to conclude that the United States needs cooperation more than it can handle things. And as a final token, unipolarism is just too expensive. It costs too much to maintain that degree of control. Authoritarian regimes, just in general, are expensive. Democracies are cheap. By effectively allowing people to have their own say, voice their own opinions, and empower them to do their own good, there's no hegemonic control on the top. If the United States does decide we need to control every aspect of the world, the United States engages in far too many commitment problems. And eventually we're going to run out of money. We can't. We can't go to war every single time that there's an injustice. We can't topple a regime every time. Look, there's no cheat code to add more money to your faction. You can't do that. So in many situations, unipolarism today is, if anything, just rhetorical statements. So, to conclude, in the remaining 5 or so minutes that we have, the unipolar dilemma that Lane pointed out more than 20 years ago, I think, still holds a lot of weight today. The unipolar dilemma is as such. Number 1, the more a hegemon attempts to impose its preferences and values on others, the more likely others will react against what they perceive to be overstretching power. The more a hegemon attempts to impose its preferences and values on others, the more likely others will react against what they perceive to be an overextension of its power and authority. That's constructivism right there, but it leans very heavily on bases of realism. 2, otherwise benign allies. Benign allies will simply balance against the hegemon to provide alternative strategies. This is something that was largely the voice of Europe 10 plus years ago against US foreign policy in Iraq. We're not anti-American. We're just simply saying a better solution to the problem. No one in Europe was in favor of supporting Saddam Hussein. But there were enough arguments saying better to keep the devil that you know in power than to unleash the unknown. Okay? That's not a threat. That's just simply a second opinion. Unipolar powers that take second opinions seriously are benign to genders. Conversely, the more that the hegemon ignores and aggressively counters these opinions, the quicker these opinions will go from constructive criticism and more to proactive challenges. Number 3, there are countries in the world today that clearly are operating against American interests. They've said it, they make no bone about it. Okay? Iran is much more anti-American than critical American. That much is painfully obvious. Iran is a major power. You cannot avoid that. But it is also then pretty obvious that rivals that make no bone about your policies, they're going to take whatever measures are necessary to increase their own security. The United States or other unipolar powers should take note and differentiate between the benign and the more aggressive. Because if you lump them all in as aggressive, unipolarism is going to collapse a lot faster. It's going to collapse. It's going to change. But what it will do is either change to something more agreeable or collapse under a complete dismissal of that unipolar's power.